So Bitcoin, we obviously know China just in the last day or so cracking down even harder on Bitcoin. So we're seeing a little bit of the short-term weakness. But the crazy thing about this is the chart has been telling us this was going to be the price action for a long period of time, right? So you had that head and shoulder pattern right here. And the beauty of head and shoulders, and the only reason they're intriguing to me is because a head and shoulder pattern that breaks the neckline, which occurred right here when this trend line broke, you can actually measure and calculate the exact target of where that head and shoulder should bottom out. What you do is you take the high pivot of the head and you drop a plumb line straight down to that neckline. That distance, whatever it may be, should be the exact distance when you break the trend line down as well. And in fact, it worked out almost to the penny on Bitcoin to complete the head and shoulders. Now, once a pattern completes, it oftentimes has a bounce. In this case, in general, what we see is markets and stocks tend to go back to what we call the scene of the crime, right? So you had all this chop, consolidation, people were worried, you know, some bulls, but then some bears meeting them. And then finally, you continue to hit this trend line, right? Pivot high, pivot high, pivot high. You pulled back and you finally broke out. And this was the signal that it was going to go back and retrace to that scene of the crime, which is that same trend line neckline that extended all the way out. Notice how as soon as it got there, I mean, this is amazing chart stuff. As soon as it got there, immediately it sold from 53,000 down to basically 43,000, which is an incredible drop in just a one-day period. From that point on, you had consolidation, and then look at where it's gone now. Right back to test the former resistance line here and here. It now is support on Bitcoin, and that's where we're holding. Now, based on everything I'm seeing, you still see further downside. You might chop and maybe float for a little bit here. Eventually, 40,000 should give way, and you'll start trading inside of this range again. That could last for a couple months, and then I think actually you do break lower, as at some point there's going to be a deleveraging here. And I don't know, again, necessarily, you know, we know the Evergrande situation in China kind of could create a little deleveraging, but it looks like China's trying to block the contagion aspects of it. But at some point, you're going to see these tremors turn into a big quake, and that deleveraging will affect the stock market and Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. And you should see Bitcoin going down to 18 to 20,000, maybe even a little bit lower. But for certain, I'll be buying at that 20,000-ish range.
Yeah, somewhere near the 200-week moving average, isn't it? I think that 20,000, if memory serves me correctly.
So Bitcoin right now, yeah, it's like trapped in between that box. So it's, Jesus. So it's done for you. You think that the highs we're probably swinging into that box, or for you, it's going to be confirmed once we go back in the lower box, then that support will become resistance, and then we have higher chances of grinding downwards, right?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, I just keep on getting stuck on the aspect that this cycle, like everyone's telling me it's different than the last cycles in Bitcoin, right? And maybe it is, but as a trader, I can't assume that until it's proven to me, right? So I have to look at history and say, okay, whenever this occurs, you know, just like what we were talking about with the 70s and 80s in gold, I mean, if that occurred then that should tell us what the future holds if that same scenario comes. And so what you have here, and I'll show my charts on this, is something really fascinating if you go back to previous cycles in Bitcoin. So if you go back to this cycle, right, and this is the 2013 highs. So you had the 2013 run up where it basically went from $100 to $1,250. You then had that big correction down to 500. It then had the huge bounce to 1,100 before rolling off and going back to 100. So I say to myself, okay, look at the recent cycle we've had where you went from, you know, 10,000 to 65,000. You then fell to 30,000, which would be the equivalent of this 500 here. You then bounced to 53,000, which was the 1,100 in that cycle. So if that continues to form, you really should have another big, you know, rollover in Bitcoin. And then you could also say, well, what about the 2017 cycle? Well, in the 2017 cycle, it was almost identical again. You had the big run up from, you know, 3,000 to 20,000. You then had this big flush out to 11,000, which again is almost identical to the 65 to 30,000 flush. Then you had this bounce all the way back to 17,000. We had the bounce to 53,000, and then the move down to 5,000. So, you know, those are the types of things where I just keep on looking at this chart and saying, okay, if it's following that, where here was your high, big flush, then bounce, and then doesn't that tell us, again, if cycles are going to hold and history is going to repeat, that we should go lower. We haven't seen a past cycle where the low has been just 50%-ish or so on a pullback on Bitcoin. So again, it's so hard to know for sure, right? But I just have to go back to the charts and look at the charts and basically go with what they're saying.
It's interesting. I mean, I'm aware of, clearly that scenario, and also, a lot of arguments for gold to move to the upside, stock to flow models and all that kind of stuff. The main thing that I keep looking back at is the Bitcoin dominance chart, which I'm just trying to compare previous behavior with how the crypto cycle ended, how the Bitcoin dominance chart broke down in a meaningful way, and the altcoins had a couple of weeks of going crazy as Bitcoin began its rapid descent. And I can't quite find in the charts that happening just at the moment.
Yeah.
Bitcoin dominance chart is still holding up, and I just wonder if we're going to have a couple of weeks of altcoins doing something similar to what they did last time, going a bit crazy, and perhaps it's to do with flows of money out of Bitcoin into alternatives, and then finally out of the crypto sector altogether. Don't know if you have any particular views about about the dominance and about altcoins.
Yeah, so I think those are some good points that make it slightly different, and it'll be interesting to see how those play out. For me, I just I can't help get away from the side that I look in these altcoins, right? And there's more and more every single day. There's so many cryptocurrencies out there, and it just to me is a reminiscence of the .coms, right? And where you had so many of these crappy .coms, just you had your business out of your mom and dad's basement, and you got listed, and all of a sudden you were worth $100 million. At some point, you have to flush a lot of this kind of junk out of the system. And then I do think eventually Bitcoin is 500,000 a coin, and you'll see the survivors thrive, just like an Amazon did, just like a Netflix did, and so forth. But yeah, it's just like I can't grasp my head around how, with so many coins out there, that a lot of them are honestly kind of useless. I mean, maybe obviously there's got to be someone that thinks it's useful, but where does this go? I mean, we can't just keep on having millions and millions of coins created, right?
No, quite right.
So the Bitcoin dominance chart, Kevin, it's like the total market cap of all cryptos, and then when Bitcoin's share shrinks, then that means the altcoins, the crappy coins, whatever you want to call them, they're actually gaining in market value. So the stuff that has less real use, the speculative ones, they're increasing in market cap, which makes it so they're bubbling. It's a bubble essentially, right?
Well, that's right. Yeah, I mean, as you say, the Bitcoin dominance chart is exactly that. It's the percentage of the crypto market by market cap that is made up of Bitcoin. I think it's somewhere between 45 and 50. It's been bouncing around between 45 and 50% or thereabouts. So yeah, and also looking at the ratio charts as well, it's quite interesting to me that the ratio charts all seem to indicate that the altcoins are set to outperform Bitcoin in quite a big way, but it just doesn't gel with the actual price behavior that you've just shown with Bitcoin, which I agree with. I agree with everything that you just said.